Welcome back to the Equities Go to the Field podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Wehmeyer.
I'm Eric Osland.
So today we got a special guest in the house, Matt Wehmeyer with Wehmeyer Seed Company. The Equities has had a long-term relationship with Wehmeyer Seed Company dating back to roughly 2006, 2007. Matt, welcome to the show. Would you mind, giving the listeners a little bit of your background and a little background on Wehmeyer Seed Company?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Ryan, and glad to be here. I am president of Wehmeyer Seed Company. We're located in Mascoutah, Illinois, 30 minutes east of St. Louis, so southwest Illinois. We have an integrated business. We also have AgriMAXX Wheat Company, and so I'm the president as well of AgriMAXX Wheat. Second generation of both. Dale is my father. He founded the seed company, and we are celebrating our 30th year this year, so 1995 to 2025. And yeah, we started working with you guys in the mid-2000s on wheat seed and had just a fantastic relationship and have enjoyed the ride with you guys. A little bit about our business is, and we were talking about this earlier, was my father managed the University of Missouri's Foundation Seed Program in the 80s and 90s. So he's originally from Missouri, moved to Illinois after college. That's where he met my mother. She's from Mascoutah. From there, they went and he took a job at the University of Missouri in the 80s and managed that program for several years. But while he was out here in Illinois working on a sow farm, he met a gentleman in church. His name was Roy, and he helped him on the farm because my dad was a farm kid and not from the area, so he helped him on the farm and sang choir with them, and they talked a lot about farming and became good friends. Well, in the early 90s, Roy's wife passed away, and very atypical story as far as where transitions in farming occur in today's world. But he came to Missouri and said, hey, I know you're working at the university, you got a really good job, but I would like for you to consider moving back to Illinois to take over my farm because I have 3 daughters and they're not interested in taking over the farm. Which is really weird. Usually you just call up your neighbor, hey, you want to farm my ground? Sure. Now, it was really different back then, but they were friends, and he always admired Dale and the work he did, and Dad viewed Roy almost as like a father-like figure as well. So in the 90s, corn was $1.50, beans are $5, and Dad's like, I can't buy your equipment and rent the farm, and it was a cattle and grain operation. I don't know if I can make that work.
Pretty hard to swing it at corn at those prices.
Yeah, and to move your family with kids across state lines and basically start over. Well, Roy, knowing Dad was in the seed business, his career, said, hey, I think this could be an area that could use a seed company. I think it'd be a good opportunity. That's the line of work you're in. That's what you specialize in, and what you know might be worth considering. But ultimately, that was the carrot that got us to move over, because Dad always wanted to farm as well. He had big ideas, wanted to farm, wanted to have a seed company, and so it was like God bringing it all together in one opportunity. We started our business in 1995, and we started as a contract soybean production company, raising contract soybeans and wheat and selling certified wheat seed, because certified seed was big in the 90s. And so that was ultimately our beginning. And we had worked with various wheat companies, and we were kind of in a tweener zone because there was usually a lot of wheat companies would have northern programs and southern programs, and one of the brands that we were working with at the time was that way. And they were just stalling out. They weren't bringing anything new to the industry, new to us, and it felt like we were doing a little bit of a disservice to our customers and people we were working with. So Dad, coming from the genetic space that he had and the relationships he had at the University of Missouri, made some few phone calls and working with some breeders, and that was ultimately the birth of AgriMAXX Wheat. There was a void that we felt here in the Midwest, specifically Illinois at the time, that we wanted to bring a high-performance wheat brand forward and specialize in wheat, because everyone was focused on corn and soybeans, and to a large extent they still are today. But we wanted to be a wheat-focused company because, ironically, you think Illinois is a corn state and a soybean state, but it's the number 1 state for soft red winter wheat acres.
So this is quite a growth story. As Dale coming over to Illinois in Mascoutah, starting a company, building AgriMAXX Wheat, a lot of things in transition. Where are you guys at today? How do you rank as far as wheat companies in the U.S.?
We are told we don't subscribe or to like the Doan survey or some other market share surveys. A lot of that effort's on corn and soybeans, but from what we've been told in the industry from those survey companies, that we rank number 3 for soft red winter wheat.
That's amazing.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Great growth story.
To be a family-owned, independent, wheat-only company. So you got to remember, soft red winter wheat's a niche crop, let's call it. There's 6-7 million acres of soft red winter wheat in the United States. There's 50-some million acres of wheat, but a lot of that's the hard red winter wheat in the plains. We realize that it's a high value. It can be a high value crop if treated and managed and cared for appropriately. And we've been very successful at that. So we've been very nimble in our approach. We're in 26 states now. So eastern Kansas is where that switchover occurs from hard red winter wheat to soft red, and then all the way to the East Coast, from the Great Lakes regions of Michigan and Wisconsin down to the Gulf, Louisiana, and the southern states. So the whole eastern U.S. is where we distribute AgriMAXX wheat.
When I started at the Equity, it was almost grab a wheat variety, go out and plant it, and hope for the best. So with that, I think that's what I enjoy, working with AgriMAXX Wheat and Wehmeyer Seed Company the best. I think we work together pretty well on identifying the best place to put these varieties and then try to put them in the best environment with the best management practices to get top yield.
You said it right. You have to put the variety in the right spot. We do a lot of work behind the scenes trying to identify that for our customers, where it will succeed, because every variety has a personality. And we put so much effort. I mean, your customers will pore over data and product guides on trying to place a corn hybrid in the right spot. Well, we try to do that on wheat. In a lot of scenarios, it's what's your best wheat variety, or let's make it a very simple transaction, and it's not the amount of effort that's poured into corn and soybeans, but we're doing that for our customers. So we ask those specific questions. What's your rotation? What's your soil type? What's your yield goals? Because what's your goals with wheat? And you'll find if you're planting corn and beans, traditionally speaking, you're going for yield. Ultimately, when you plant wheat, it could be a variety of different factors. So I'm planting wheat because I need the straw. I'm planting wheat because I'm trying to improve my soil organic matter, or I'm trying to reduce erosion. Maybe that's their targeted goals, and yield and performance is secondary. I don't know. I was out in Delaware one time inspecting a wheat field. There's only 3 counties in Delaware, by the way, but there's a lot of wheat. They use a lot of the wheat in the eastern shore for straw. And I park at the house and I walk out into the field, and I'm walking back to the car, and the wife comes out and she has this funny look on her face like, who are you and why are you in my field? It was one of our seed fields. And I said, hey, I'm Matt Wehmeyer. I'm with AgriMAXX Wheat. I'm just checking on our seed field. Oh, that's great. Yeah, that's such and such. I sure hope it bails out well. Huh? Bails out well? Oh, yeah. But don't you mean bushels out? She goes, no, we just want the straw because we make more money per acre on the straw than we do the grain. That taught me that there's different reasons why we plant wheat. And as we move north, you really need the double crop to work. Wheat by itself is usually not as profitable, but in conjunction with the double crop soybean acre or double crop milo or whatever double crop you're using, then it becomes a much more viable economic option. So,
For sure.
So I just want early. Just give me the earliest variety you have, because I need that double crop soybean to work. I'll take a little less yield up front to make sure that 3-dimensional acre comes together.
And as you move into southern Illinois, it's hard on some of these soils to raise an excellent corn crop. So the wheat and double crop beans can be a great option and can be a very profitable acre at times.
Most definitely. There's counties in southern Illinois that will have a corn APH 130, 150, just because it's not as productive. It's thinner soils, it's timber soils. But we can raise 100 bushel to the acre wheat with 40 to 50 bushel double crop. We can produce the same amount of bushels in corn as we can with wheat and double crop in that same year, and we're selling it at a much higher value. If you look at a map of where wheat's planted in the state of Illinois, that's why it's dominated in the southern half of the state.
So talk to a little bit about the history of Wehmeyer Seed Company and AgriMAXX Wheat. Been a great partner for the Equity for a long time. So we're getting ready. We're we'll be coming out of dormancy with the wheat, and then we've got some management decisions and things. So let's dive into that a little bit and talk about some of these best management practices with wheat. So the first thing that comes to my mind, have you ever been asked how much nitrogen to put on a wheat crop?
That's the $1,000,000 question. It's every single year.
I said that jokingly
I
because
know.
I think it comes up every year.
It does. And ultimately, the nitrogen is the number one driver in yield potential in wheat. You can manipulate wheat very easily, good and bad, with nitrogen. From a ballpark, what's the dartboard look like? 80 pounds on the low side to 140, 150 on the high side.
So there's some different factors why I would be at 80 pounds of N versus 140 pounds of N or 150. So let's dive into that. So if I'm trying to decide what my nitrogen, where do I even start?
It really matters it's a three-dimensional approach. You hear me say three-dimensional several times because it's not linear. Let's look at a tiller count. What's our plant density at today? And then where do we need to go? Additionally, we want to look at what's our rotation? Are we behind corn? Are we behind soybeans? Are we no-till? Are we conventional tillage? Were we planted early? Were we planted late? All those factors kind of come into this decision as well. And what has been laid out in prior years, whether it's a really high fertility program, you have very good soil test levels, or maybe it's the opposite. It's kind of low fertility. What's your organic matter? And do you have any manure history? So those are all the things we look at to try to develop a specific nitrogen recommendation. And we farm as well. You just want to just say, well, what's the number? Is it 110 pounds? Is it 115? Is it 130? I don't know. We need to look at where you're at. So starting on a tiller count, and I think, Ryan, we've talked about it with a lot of your guys on conducting these tiller counts and what's the best approach. So let's assume we're at 7.5-inch rows.
Can we back up? So looking at that, we know that corn, we've talked about this as well. So somewhere in between 0.8 and 1.2 pounds per bushel somewhere is that sweet spot for nitrogen on corn. Is there a sweet spot for wheat?
The formula, the calculation that you referred to on wheat is for every bushel of grain, it's 1.88 pounds of nitrogen that's taken into the plant. Now, that's not spring only, that's from planting through harvest. In that sense of calculation, if you're targeting 100 bushel to the acre wheat, that means that plant will utilize 188 pounds of nitrogen through the growing season.
So that makes sense, and that's where you're talking about wheat following soybeans, or if you have wheat planted behind corn, or how much nitrogen is in your fertilizer application in the fall, all goes into that equation.
Exactly. So what would be a common fall fertility program?
Normally, it just depends. Somebody could use DAP, and it all depends back to whether this person's going to be taking the straw off. So that's going to dictate some of the potassium levels and everything there as well. But on average, you're probably looking at about 150 pounds of DAP or 150 pounds of MES10, which has sulfur in it. So you're probably looking at that, and then maybe anywhere in between, say, 75 to 150 pounds up to 200 pounds of potassium. Potash.
So you're looking at, let's use your DAP example, 150 pounds of DAP. You have 27 pounds of nitrogen coming from your DAP. So in this example of 188, and we take off, let's just say 30 for easy math, we're at 158 pounds of nitrogen that we need to bridge the gap to go to the promised land. How much is coming from either a soybean credit, manure application, if there's history of manure, or organic matter? What's a common organic matter? Let's say we were talking 2%.
Yeah, 2.5%. So, depending on what that percentage organic matter is going to dictate how much nitrogen we can maybe mineralize from some of that as well, right?
Correct, because your soil's worth something. There's value in the soil with fertility, and let's utilize that.
We hope so. There's a lot of talk about raising that organic matter, so hopefully there's some value in that. So
let's just say we're at 2%, and this is where it gets a little tricky sometimes, is because you don't know how much that field will mineralize in any given season, because the rule of thumb is 10 to 25 pounds. Well, that's a big range.
But that's all dependent on rainfall, right? So there's a lot of factors that go into that mineralization within a year.
So let's say 15. We'll kind of err on the lower side, but shoot the middle. So at 2%, we're at 30 pounds of nitrogen that we should get from the soil. So we're at 158 minus another 30, we're at 128. So if there's no other sources of nitrogen, we need to try to look at perhaps a 128 pound or 120 to 130 for spring applied nitrogen.
For a 100 bushel wheat crop.
Exactly.
And I think that's important, because when you're thinking about wheat compared to maybe something like corn, that excess nitrogen can actually penalize us in wheat. So if we have too much soil supply or potentially too much nitrogen coming from our previous crop, and then we don't account for that, and we add too much nitrogen to the actual wheat crop, that can actually hurt us in wheat, where maybe we don't see that as much in something like corn.
Yeah, with corn and beans, you're only hurting the pocketbook if you over apply. When it comes to wheat, yeah, you overspent, but now you have to pick it up off the ground. And that's always a laborious chore. No one really likes harvesting lodged wheat. So that perfect scenario of maximizing wheat yield without causing any lodging is where we're always trying to dial in the sweet spot for our management. If I have 5% of my field leaning over and starting to lodge, that means we've likely maximized yield on the other 95%, which is usually where we're going to get the best results.
Going off, we worked with Wehmeyer Seed Company and AgriMAXX to develop our Go 120, which is trying to get field averages of 120 bushels of wheat per acre. So we've got a best management practices sheet put together. So looking at that, Matt, before I backed you up earlier, we were going to start going down the road of tiller counts. So, and that's going to affect your nitrogen application. So with that, I'm going to look for the number of tillers, which is going to help dictate when I make my nitrogen applications as well.
Exactly.
So if that's the case, can you walk us through the best way to do a tiller count?
Yes, so the best way to approach a tiller count is the formulation is you need to know the number of plants and you need to know how many tillers are on each plant, because that'll give you the tiller density that we're looking to measure. So let's assume you're on a 7.5 inch row spacing, because that's a common row spacing. 19.2 inches of row will give you 1 square foot. So let's just start there. I know it's very short, and so you can get some erratic results if you only pick out 19.2 inches of row, but this will
give us a benchmark, and we can do it
Exactly.
in several spots in the field, right?
Exactly. So dig up the whole 19.2 inches. Do a plant count, and you'll be able to determine, where the seed is. You'll still be able to see the seed, and so you'll count how many plants you have. At 1.5 million seeds per acre, which is kind of an average seeding rate, that would equate to 34 plants within that row. So if you count 34 plants, you're at about 1.5 million, which is what you strove to achieve. So what you want to do next is pick up an individual plant and knock off you've already knocked off the soil around the roots. You're going to get a good observation of the root system, which is like an hourglass. Usually the roots are going to mimic the top of what you see above ground is what's below ground. And then you want to count the number of tillers or stems that's within each seed, that comes from each seed. And in order for a tiller to officially count, it needs to have 2 leaves. So you will quickly notice what was a fall tiller. It'll be the fattest stem, the biggest stem there is, and then you'll have some puny ones that are just kind of scrawny. And well, do I count that? Do I not? Don't count it for now, for this calculation. The goal is to have 600 to 800 heads per square yard. And I know I gave you this measurement in a square foot. So let's count. Let's say we have 3 tillers per plant on average. And you counted 34 times 3, that's roughly 100, a little over 100. There's 9 square feet in a square yard. So times that by 9, you're at 900 tillers per square yard. So you're on the high side. If we're wanting 600 to 800 heads and every head comes from a tiller, you're at 900. That's a great spot to be, because some of those heads might shake loose and abort. Or some of those tillers, might shake loose and abort between now and harvest. So you want to be a tick on the higher side, in my opinion, going in. So once we've determined our tiller density, then we can determine how much nitrogen and when. So in a nitrogen program, let's assume from our previous example, we need 128 pounds of nitrogen. That's what we want to target. Okay, so once we've determined that, when do we put it on? Do we put it all on early? Back in the day, 20, 30 years ago, we would go out and spread dry urea on frozen ground in January, and it'd be all the nitrogen for the season. Some years we had lodging, some years we didn't. I would suspect the years we had lodging was when we were in an overly robust tiller situation, and years we didn't lodge is when we were thin and we needed the nitrogen. We had good wheat. So today, look at your nitrogen in the spring. The first application, there's two ways. You can do a single application or you can split it. Split it has become very popular in recent years because we're being more targeted with our nitrogen application, better stewards of nitrogen use efficiencies, and applying the nitrogen when the plants want it. So if we go out early at Feeks growth stage 3, 4 at green up, when it's just starting to wake up, that first application is only managing your tiller density. The second application would then be your one driving yield. And
so if you're a little low on that initial tiller count, say maybe it comes in at 600 for 500 tillers, then in that situation, we might want to add some nitrogen to maybe get some of those tillers that are a little bit younger to catch up.
Exactly.
Where if that tiller count is, like you said, in the 900 level, by adding nitrogen in that situation, we're probably hurting ourselves because we're going to ultimately end up with too many mature tillers. It's going to end up with a bunch of weed on the ground. So that's why that tiller count's so important, and that's probably one of the first things we want to do when we get to that green up stage and weeds starting to come out of dormancy, so we kind of know where we're at. Is that about right?
That's exactly right. And you're looking at, do I need to speed the crop up? Do I need to maintain and hold what's there? Or do I just need to not do anything and let it shake loose and come down? There's times where you count, if you plant really early, let's say in this geography, 2 weeks ahead of fly free, which would land you late September. If you're planting in September and it was really warm and you planted a high population, you could have 1,500 tillers per square yard. That's way too many. So we don't need to add nitrogen to hold everything or to encourage more tillers. We need to maybe shake loose of a couple. So I don't want to say starve it out effectively, but it's okay to let the plants grow and then hit it later in the season with nitrogen and make that nitrogen more available during grain fill, which is where you're going to drive your yield.
Yeah, it's kind of cool that we can hit the gas or hit the brakes with nitrogen.
You get to manipulate the crop.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
So what are your target tiller accounts? I'm looking at the sheet here. If you've got less than 400 tillers, what we've put together is you're applying about 60 pounds at green up.
If you're running a split program, 60, 70. If you want to run a single shot program, because there's some growers that just want to hit it one time with nitrogen, put it all on at that in that scenario, because it was a late planted field or it was planted and it got wet and cool, didn't get the fall growth that we wanted to achieve. You're looking at 400 tillers and you planted 300, you're looking at 1 tiller per plant, 1.2. There's some plants that will have 2 tillers. It's just a thin crop. You need to give it a kick.
And if I'm in between that 500 and 700 tillers, I'm looking about 45 pounds. In a split application, I'm looking about 45 pounds at green up, somewhere in that nature.
Correct, yeah, 45, 50, depending on how you want to travel across the field. And what that's called, Ryan, is a maintenance shot. You're maintaining the tillers you have. So the first one was a build, and this one was a maintain.
And if I'm over 800 tillers, then I could put a majority of that on a little bit later on in the season.
Correct. Yeah, because if you're in an excessive scenario, and if you want to still split, back it off to 30 pounds, because you're not wanting to encourage additional growth. You don't want it to get overly thick. So maybe 30 would just be enough if you get into a wet March scenario. If you have worked ground and maybe traveling is somewhat of a concern some years, and you don't want it to get into that period of deficiency, let's put out 30. You can feel good about having 30 out there as a base. It's not enough to really get it going and get it out of control. And then you look at, well, if our target was 130, 128, let's just call it 130, and we've put on 30, now I can apply 100 pounds of nitrogen at jointing. And that second application, that 100, will be available for grain fill.
And that's when we're building that yield in
Yes.
late season.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And this is it's not a finite way to do it, right? So there's some movement within this nitrogen application. We're talking about a perfect application in an imperfect world in agriculture. So a grower's going to have to make it work in their schedule.
Mm-hmm.
So with that, I don't want to go too far down the road without mentioning probably the fourth most important nutrient within wheat. So sulfur is a very big component of wheat yield. So from what I've been told, some of the stuff that we've worked on, I think it's about 25 pounds of sulfur per 100 bushels of wheat.
Correct.
So how do we get there? And we know we need to make that part of the application. We need to get sulfur in the plant somehow. I know that Equity, we use some MES 10. So we get some sulfur maybe in that fall application with fertilizer, which half of that sulfur is available right away. And then the other half is elemental sulfur, which would be a little bit more available at grain fill. But then there's also some other ways that we can get sulfur into the plant as well. We can make some ammonium thiosulfate applications along with our UAN 32, 28%. When we make those applications, is there a better time or another to make that sulfur application?
Really, you want to combine it with a pass you're already making. You want to, and ultimately, a lot of our decisions will revolve around convenience. When can we tank mix something and create efficiencies in the field versus redundancies? And so the neat thing about sulfur is it's symbiotic to nitrogen. We're going to be running across the field in the spring with either liquid nitrogen or dry. So if you're running like a dry urea, you can use AMS and get your sulfur in that form. If you're running liquid, ATS like you mentioned, and just combining it. There's discussions and there's always conversations of, do I put it on my first shot? Do I put it on my second shot? Do I split it? We can say yes, do it. And perhaps one thing to look at is, we've seen the benefits in corn, and knowing that having sulfur with nitrogen creates that symbiotic relationship, I'm always a fan of splitting it and including a little bit of sulfur with my nitrogen pass. So if your first nitrogen pass is, let's say, 60 pounds of N, and you're coming back with another 60 pounds of N, just to make it real generic, let's mix 2.5 gallons of ATS on the first shot. Let's mix 2.5 gallons on the second shot. A 10-to-1 ratio is very achievable and where a lot of the recommendations revolve around. So for every 2.5 gallons of ATS, you're getting a little over 7 pounds of nitrogen. And so your soil's, again, worth something in the form of supplying power. If we need 25 pounds of sulfur, and we looked earlier.
You get about 3 to 5 pounds of sulfur per percent of organic matter. So if we're back to that 2% organic matter, and we use the high side, say at 5 pounds of sulfur, so 2%, you'd be at 10 pounds of sulfur supplied by the soil.
And then if we run 5 gallons of ATS, you're running about 14 pounds of applied. So that gets you right at 24.
Yeah. So if ATS is your only source of sulfur, it's going to take roughly around 5 gallons of ATS in that application.
That has seemed to work well with a lot of guys I talked with. And there's a little bit of stabilization that can occur because you will get some nitrogen with that in the ammonium form. And so that'll help. Now you have to remember some of your soil tests. If you have a soil test that will measure sulfur and you're running a 12-inch core, that sulfur is deeper in the zone. When the wheat plant will show deficiencies is earlier in the season when your roots might only be 3-4 inches deep, because it's a shallow rooting crop early, and then it'll shoot its roots deeper in the spring. So when we're including sulfur with our nitrogen in February and March, we're bridging the gap between where the plant could use the sulfur before the roots find it down deep.
Yeah, for sure. I think the moral of the story is to make sure that you get sulfur in some sort of fashion on your wheat crop. Mm-hmm. And looking at that, your organic matter is going to supply somewhere in between 3 and 5 pounds per percent. And there's a multitude of ways to get sulfur in that wheat crop. Whether you used MES 10 in the fall, there's some application there. There's AMS, dry AMS that we can use in the spring. Maybe that's part of if we're using, dry urea for our nitrogen source, and we can mix AMS with that application. And then also ATS if we're using liquid. So
yeah, I really like that idea. Every time we're going out there and making a nitrogen pass, if we can make that ratio maybe 1 to 10 or maybe 1 to 8 of nitrogen to sulfur, I think that's going to allow us to get that product out there when the plant's going to need it.
And bear in mind, you have some areas in your footprint that have more sandier profiles. And so,
For sure.
And in those specific areas, the need for sulfur and the need for nitrogen is going to be greater because the leachability factor is so much higher. The risk factor is higher. And
Generally lower organic matter, just
Correct.
less of that nitrogen and sulfur is going to be there from the year before, and all of these different supplying powers in the soil.
So you'll see even a more significant return on investment in those scenarios.
Absolutely. So looking at that, talking about the nitrogen and the sulfur piece, we don't stop there. So there's more in-season management that needs to take place. So with that, moving on, probably the next thing to look at is weed control. So when we're looking at that, we've got, depending on when it was planted, how the crop went in, what winter annuals were started already last fall that are just going to keep on going. They're going to start stooling out. They're going to be bigger. They could take away a lot of the nutrients and everything from this wheat crop. So looking at that, there's a couple different options in the market, and majority of the time that acre gets a Harmony application. So when do you feel is the best time to make that Harmony application?
The best time for the plants is when it's warm and actively growing. Harmony can have some adverse effects when it's cool and wet, and when the plants are trying to metabolize it, you can see the crop response at times. So we do want to make sure that the forecast 3 to 5 days after application, because there's some times where we get some very volatile temperatures in the spring. We want to make sure the temperatures are at where we're at or climbing, not diving back down to freezing temperatures.
And you don't want to spray on one good warm day and then all of a sudden dive back below freezing the next.
Correct.
So, it's with any weed control application, you want to make sure that you're targeting an actively growing weed that's going to take in the chemical, and ultimately it's going to perish, hopefully.
Yeah. You want the product to work.
That's right.
Would you say on 50-degree temperatures, you want to be above that, or is there a range of temperatures you want to try to target?
Oh, 50 would be fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you're in the 50s, rock and roll. And I think we've had a very cold last 30 days here, and I think that's going to be to our advantage in keeping some of these weeds at bay, because in years past where we've had a really warm December and a really warm January, weeds will break dormancy faster than wheat will. And once they're actively growing, that first application you lay down of nitrogen, those weeds are going to enjoy a big portion of that. You're feeding two crops. You're feeding the wheat and the weeds. So depending on how much weed pressure you have will determine when you need it. And, Harmony, we use Harmony for garlic predominantly.
Yep.
And if you put Harmony on here's where it gets kind of tricky, because when you put it on too early, you miss the garlic. So but there's some farms that don't have garlic issues. An alternative herbicide you could use if you don't worry about garlic is Culex. Culex is much better at colder temperatures than what Harmony would be. So that could be an alternative product, and there's some growers that are mixing Culex and Harmony together in various ratios and Culex is very good on broadleaf control, in particular marestail.
And ideally, I'm probably targeting a rule of thumb is what I've always had is I'm going to try to get 3 consecutive days at 50-degree temps. And usually if I get that and I can string 3 of those days together, I'm going to get pretty good weed kill.
Yeah. And if you're not at a severe pressure, waiting for warmer temperatures is a good thing. But if you have a high pressure weed control scenario, a lot of weeds out there, you're going to try to want to target it as fast as you can, so it's not competing during that tillering and early growth stages.
Yeah, it's just like anything, any other crop. We don't want to let the weeds out there compete with our crop. We don't have the numbers for wheat like we might with corn and soybean on how much yield loss we're going to get for every inch of weed that's outgrown in the field, but I'm sure that those numbers probably exist, and there's going to be yield loss that we're going to start to see really quickly.
So moving into that too, there's also some potential additives. If I'm making that Harmony application, I'm out there scouting for some other things as well. So one of the biggest things in that early application is probably aphids.
Correct.
And the aphid is the vector for the barley yellow dwarf virus. which can be pretty damaging as we get a little bit later into the season.
Correct. Yeah. BYDV, barley yellow dwarf virus, is vectored via aphids, and aphids can come in the fall, and they can come in the spring. They can come in all year, but they're the most damaging early on when the plants are younger because they will vector the virus, and the longer the plants have a virus, the more damage it'll have. And so if you have aphids in the fall, that's usually cause for concern. You can have aphids in the spring as well, and there's some scenarios and some years where aphids can come in and be just as damaging early spring as they would occur in fall. Knowing that, I don't know, because not every aphid will vector the virus. However, if they feed on a plant that has the virus, they in turn become positive for the virus and then transmit it to another plant. So what percentage of the aphid population is virus positive can vary year to year, but what you want to do is if you see aphids out there, and they're kind of hard to find early in the spring, but you can clean them up with your herbicide pass, and a lot of guys have gotten into the habit of doing it. If you want to look at, some guys use IPM approach, and they have threshold numbers, and that's a good policy to go on. I know the university would like to hear that, and some other guys are going to take a different approach, and if they see it, they're going to go after it. And when there's one cockroach, there's more cockroaches. When there's one aphid, there's more aphids type mentality.
And they can blow up fast too.
Under the right conditions, yeah, their population can blow up really, really fast. So it's just something to monitor and certainly take care of them when you got them.
Absolutely, and it's an economical application too. Pyrethroids are out there, they're relatively inexpensive, so it can be money well spent.
Yeah.
Moving on, is there a variety that is better than others when it comes to barley yellow dwarf virus?
Yes, there are genetic differences, and we do rate that in our product guide. So we have a barley yellow dwarf virus rating on a 1 to 10 scale. The way the plants exhibit the symptomology, that makes a grower more concerned or less concerned, because there are some varieties when they get barley yellow dwarf, they will display the disease at a very real purple, almost like a phosphorus deficiency purple. And there's other varieties that'll be really bright yellow. And so just determining the severity of the symptomology and how many plants were affected by the virus is how we determine our rating. And so we do rate them. The name is barley yellow dwarf virus, so the plants will become yellow, and in their severe cases, they will become stunted, which is where the dwarf name comes from. So they will have, the flag leaves will be yellow, and usually we will know it a little bit too late. So it'll be the flag leaf that is exhibiting the yellow symptomology. You think, why is my flag leaf yellow? Well, that's barley yellow dwarf. Is there anything I can do about it? No. This occurred months ago when the plants were littler, and they're just now showing the disease.
We've seen a fair amount of it last year in some of the wheat around. Mm-hmm. So you get around, you get to see a lot of wheat. If barley yellow dwarf virus is bad in a field, how many bushels can you take away?
It can be 20 to 30. If it was a fall infected in a high severity, it can be 20 to 30. And the heads, you'll see the heads, they'll be shorter heads, they'll be black heads, there won't be much grain produced in them, there'll be more shriveled kernels. You can identify it even as it approaches maturity. You can see what fields had barley yellow dwarf virus. Another
rating you have on the guide is stripe rust.
Mm-hmm.
So with that, what are we looking for in the spring when it comes to stripe rust? How do we mitigate that? Is it only genetic? Is that the only way we can mitigate it, or is there other things that we can do to help mitigate some of the stripe rust that could be a potential yield robber in the spring?
In 2016, we had a really bad stripe rust year, and that was very good for us to see. We tend to like when we're breeding and testing and developing and looking at pre-commercial stuff. We like to have these scenarios occur where it was like an epidemic of stripe rust come through. Well, that cleaned up a program rather fast, and it culled out a lot of the weak ones. So our stripe rust ratings are significantly better today than what they were. I mean, that was a huge benefit. Same with scab. When you get real scabby years, and I'm sure we'll get on that topic, but that can really flush out a lot of the weak ones, and only the strong survive. So the genetics have gotten a lot better. Stripe rust is the disease that'll come in later in the season, flag leaf timing and later through grain fill, and it can be hard on some yield when it's really severe. So what varieties you'll see it on first, We walk plots, and we have checked varieties that are weak. So when stripe rust moves in, we know it's in the area. Now we can gauge how resistant a variety is. Is a variety somewhat resistant to that first initial wave, or are they just completely susceptible? And there's varying levels of all the way up to fully resistant. There are crop management practices via fungicides that are very effective. So if stripe rust is moving in at flag leaf or a little bit later, some growers can elect to spray a preventative fungicide if they don't see it yet and they hear it, or they can spray a curative at that point as well and clean it up. Stripe rust will blow in from the south. So it'll come from Texas, it'll come from Arkansas, Louisiana. Louisiana fights stripe rust every year. We haven't seen stripe rust recently because there hasn't been a lot of wheat acres in the south to host the disease and continue to push it north. And so as the southern geographies have planted less wheat, at one time Arkansas was over 1 million acres of wheat. Now they're under 200,000. So as those acres have really peeled back and growers planted other crops, the host fields aren't as prevalent anymore. So that's one of the reasons why we don't see as much stripe rust. And then you need the prevailing trade winds to push, the disease up into our region. So really windy Marches, warm, windy Marches, which March tends to be windy anyway. When you guys are putting burn down on, it seems like we're navigating winds as much as anything. That's when the disease is pushing up. So we monitor what's happening in the south to give us an indicator of what's to come. So yeah, you can spray fungicides, and there's times where you can spray it as a pseudo-preventative measure, like if you are applying that herbicide and insecticide, and you could tank mix for a convenience pass and throw in a fungicide early on, and that'll give you a few weeks worth of protection. Again,
and there's quite a few options for a fungicide at that time. And when you get into later in the season and that head has come out of the stem per se, and you're a little bit more limited, but up until flag leaf, your options are pretty wide, right?
Yeah, you got quite a few options leading up to it.
Tebuconazole, propiconazole, I think Top Guard's out there. Even I think there's some people putting some Trivapro on early in the season as well as a preventative fungicide.
Lots of options and some pretty economical ones.
Absolutely. So let's move into the money shot fungicide a little bit.
Yeah.
This is the big one. I mean, it's the one that we all worry about. The timing is crucial, and it's the hardest to manage. Mm-hmm. We're talking about scab, Fusarium head blight. It can rob you of a lot of bushels and overall quality of your wheat. So with that, when is the best application to prevent head scab?
Early bloom, the onset of bloom. So the growth stage technically is Feek's 10.51, which is 20% bloom. And bear in mind, when you're making those specific growth stage call-outs, 50% of the crop has to be within that growth stage for that to move forward. So you're looking at half the field at early bloom is 10.51. And so the process, you go from flag leaf to in the boot, and then the boot will swell and the head splits out of the boot, and traditionally it will push up above the flag leaf 2-3 inches, and then it'll initiate bloom. That's the traditional sense. Now, we haven't talked on Palisade. Palisade can change that process.
We forgot Palisade. That's kind of essential for making your wheat stand at high nitrogen rates.
That, and it can alter your visual of when that wheat is blooming, because if you have Palisade on, I've seen it, and it's variety specific, but sometimes that wheat head will split the sheath. It'll push up maybe a half inch, and it'll initiate bloom almost as if it's coming out of the sheath, which is kind of different. And so if you're doing a drive-by, you still see a lot of flag leaves up high, and you don't see many heads. Well, I'm not ready yet while the wheat plant's already starting to bloom. And so just not being out in the field and understanding it. Do you want to talk about Palisade real quick?
Let's finish with the head scab, and then we'll back up and then talk about Palisade and its importance, if that works.
Yeah. So Feek's 10.51 early bloom is optimal. There's various fungicides out there, and we've seen studies, and there's universities that will study it. The chem manufacturers will have studies on it, and and we've had studies ourselves. There's some products that you can spray early, and there's some that they wouldn't recommend early. So, legacy products like Prosaro and Carumba didn't really offer that window to go early. It was more optimal. Mirvis Ace came along. Hey, we can spray early. It's better than Prosaro and Carumba. That was correct. In controlling head scab, when you spray Mirvis Ace early, before bloom, it was better at controlling scab. What I think we've observed is that we missed the vomitoxin piece when we go early. The studies have shown that going later, 2 to 3 days, 4 days later, is better than going 2 to 3 days early. I would always recommend, and a lot of guys are falling into this line of thinking, if I would prefer to go a couple days later than a couple days early. And Mirvis Ace does allow you to go early, but it's still better optimum to late, because you will pick up that piece. And one thing we observed this year, we had a lot of rain in May, the whole Midwest. And so we had more head scab, we had lighter test weights than we had the prior years. And we did have some isolated pockets of vomitoxin, which is Don, at the elevator, and they were receiving discounts. And this is anecdotal, this is just what I've been talking with growers. Those that were triggering dockages were ones that put on fungicide early. And I think the vomitoxin developed a little bit later. And that week's difference, or that 5 days difference in application made the difference.
And the timing of this is so hard.
Yeah.
I mean, we're in the application business at the Equity, right? And then managing some of these applications and getting it done timely. You always have to be looking at the forecast, what kind of weather you're going to be up against. I mean, like you said, the wind can be blowing. We may have a week of rain. Well, the wheat's not going to wait for a week before you spray it. So you do have to make some of those, the best management decision you can at the time.
Oh yeah, and let's just, if there's a scenario where you have a week's worth of solid rain, yeah, you can go a couple days early, because that's better than nothing. Because eventually you might time ourselves out and get past the window of opportunity to even spray at all. So that's just something you'll have to do a gut management decision at that point in time. But from what I can tell, optimum and late is better than early every single time. So that's generally where the recommendations fall. And when it comes to fungicide, I don't know many growers that won't grow wheat without making that application anymore. It's so vital to the overall performance of the crop, because wheat is so connected to the food system, the food chain. I mean, you're taking those kernels and grinding it in the flour and consuming the flour. There's not a whole lot of processing like you see in corn and soybeans. And so it's the only crop, when we're making management decisions based on corn and beans, we're looking at yield as the return on investment. How many more bushels does this application or this product or this thing provide for the return on investment? Wheat, with the Fusarium head blight head scab application, and the main products are Prosaro, Carumba, Prosaro Pro, Spherex, and then Mirvis Ace. So you got 5 lead products, of which the original Carumba and Prosaro are probably trailing off. I think Prosaro Pro, Spherex, and Mirvis Ace are the lead 3, right?
Mirvis Ace and Prosaro Pro are Equity's lead products.
Yeah.
We've just had the best luck with those two, and that's what we've been sticking to the last few years.
And they're really good, and it can provide a 3-way return on investment. So you can receive a return on investment via yield, which plenty of documentation. We did a study in Kentucky this year across all of the AgriMAXX varieties, and remember, it was a really wet year. We saw an 18 bushel response to fungicide.
Wow.
And that's averaging all the varieties. And so that you get your return on investment on yield, but we also have return on investment via the avoidance of dockage. So if you're in a low test weight scenario, you get docked. Fungicide has proven itself to preserve your test weight. So if you can avoid dockage, if you're at 58.5, and if you didn't have fungicide, you're at 57, what is that, a quarter? I don't know what the dockage schedule is, but let's say it's 25 cents a bushel. You're at $25 an acre just on the avoidance of dockage. If we get into a vomitoxin scenario and you're getting docked for vomitoxin, we had a few years back, we had 3 seed fields of a variety, and it was 2 of them received fungicide, 1 did not. The one that did not receive fungicide was at like a 75 cent per bushel dock scenario.
I've heard upwards of like $1.20 And
Yeah, or they don't even take the wheat.
that's right.
So that you're looking at a $600 an acre return on investment in the crazy scenario of it's so bad. And I hate to be a doomsdayer, but there are isolated areas where vomitoxin can be so bad they don't take your wheat. Now, are you going to go from taking it to full price wheat? Maybe not, but you're going to avoid a lot of that heartache of trying to sell your wheat.
Before we had some of these products, like the Miravis Ace and the Prosaro Pro, I don't know how many people they would grow wheat one year and then they'd end up taking a dock just because they didn't have that application in the arsenal. And then it would drive them away from wheat for a little while, and then they would come back, and it would happen again. I mean, wheat was kind of like a yo-yo, and now I think we're getting to a point where it's a little more predictable. We can manage some things and make yield a little more predictable with the wheat crop.
And the genetics have gotten better.
100%.
So we're looking at a lot of, FHB1, FHB2 genes within the plant, marker-assisted selection, so we know what's going to carry a much higher head scab resistance rating in the plants, and we're seeing it in the field too. So genetics have improved significantly, and also the use of fungicides. So the prevalence and occurrence of head scab problems have certainly decreased in recent years.
Excellent. So let's go back to Palisade Max. I think we forgot to mention that. Palisade Max, good product on the marketplace, and basically what it does is it shortens the wheat. So this helps mitigate some of that issue with wheat falling down at harvest. So some of the people that are pushing for high nitrogen rates, trying to maximize the yield, Palisade Max is a good product that we can use to help mitigate some of that risk of the wheat falling down, closer to harvest.
Correct. Yep. And all it is if you're wanting to push for yield, you're going to push higher nitrogen rates, and then your risk of lodging increases. So it's a tool designed to reduce your risk of lodging, so you can thereby apply more nitrogen, or rest assured if you're planting in a field that has a manure history and you can't accurately predict that nitrogen release from the manure, then you just improve your overall experience. And remember, we double crop. Double cropping into lodged wheat can be a challenge. The straw is tougher, it's laying down. Cutting through that with our planter is not as easy as with the good standing wheat variety. So it will go over into your double crop soybean stand as well.
I'm sure a lot of hairpinning at that time,
Exactly.
trying to get the beans out of the ground to sit and dry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think what you said about just improving the experience overall, when we're growing wheat and we can add some predictability of how it's going to respond out in the field, whether that's because maybe it accessed a little bit more nitrogen than what we thought it was going to. If we can keep it a little shorter, we're not going to run into those lodging issues that cause us all kinds of problems come harvest time.
Yeah, and we rate our varieties on standability, and if you're not going crazy with nitrogen, if you're putting out 100 pounds of nitrogen on a no manure history, average piece of soil with just average organic matter, average fertility, with a good standing variety, you probably don't need it. But it's designed for those that are wanting more fertile soil.
Manure history,
higher nitrogen rates, higher planting populations, earlier planting dates. So when the earlier you plant, the taller the plants are going to be, the more tillers you're going to have. All that is set up for a higher risk of lodging.
And it's a rate range from 10.5 to, I think, 14 ounces per acre. Mm-hmm. And this can go on with your Harmony application.
Yeah, it's one of those convenient passes to where ideally you want it to be warm and those plants actively growing as well for that product to work. Like it or not, it's going to be in a convenience pass with everything else.
Absolutely. One thing I forgot to mention as well, and it's going to be a plug for our Green Creek Drones company. Mm-hmm. So talking about that, the Miravis Ace application, or also the Prosaro Pro, one thing, and it's helped. We cannot always travel at that time. We get a bunch of spring rain, some issues there. That's what's helped us tremendously over the last few years, is being able to apply some of those with drones. It's been a godsend, really.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Because also there's some other things going on at that time too that can be a little bit tough. We're trying to make some burn down applications. We're trying to spray corn. We've got a lot of things going on, and so does the grower at that time. So that's another thing that we can do is maybe manage some of those applications with a drone.
Yeah, we've done it. I've done it personally, and they do a good job. They're a little more sensitive to a crosswind and a windier day, but if that occurs, you're not flying, and so they've been able to open up the window to where if it's too wet to travel by ground, they've opened up another tool to allow growers to be more accurate, more timing, and you're getting a higher percentage. In my mind, you're getting a higher percentage of that field covered. Because if you're using a helicopter and an airplane, and they do a nice job, but they're a little more dependent on how your field lays. If you have a big wide open field with not a lot of trees and their approach is nice, they can get a wonderful coverage. But if you're surrounded with power lines or trees and it's a cut up field, you're just going to be limited on how they can dive in and really ultimately cover the field.
Are you saying that wheat doesn't get planted in the square 40s all the time?
No. It'll be really, if it's in a square 40 and there's no trees, it'll be a really high yielding field.
Absolutely. I mean, it's what it is. It gets planted on some of the tougher acres, and it's a reliable crop that you can put on that tough acre. And we do have fields that are surrounded by trees and rolling ground, lighter soils. It's a great crop
And
for
the
that.
smaller the field and the more unique it is and it's how it's laid, ground rig will drive down wheat. And that's okay. And I like a ground rig. I think ground rig is the best. You get the most uniform, highest degree of coverage with the ground rig, but some fields you end up driving down more wheat than you feel like you're benefiting sometimes. Ideal spot for a drone.
For sure. For sure. Hey, one thing before we go, Matt, this has been great. I've enjoyed this a lot. So we've got been working with you over the last few years, but several years on our your 100 bushel, 125, and 150 bushel clubs.
Yeah.
Would you mind talking about that a little bit?
So the clubs, whether it's 100, 125, or 150, is a group of elite farmers that are averaging over those respective levels. And
These are field averages.
field averages, yeah, and it's tremendous. I mean, some of these, you have growers in the 150 bushel club, and you just think about that. Even at $6 wheat and 150 bushel to the acres, it's $900 an acre revenue off of wheat, and we haven't even got to double crop soybeans yet. But even at 100 bushel, it's tremendous. And so we launched this in 2011. So 14 years ago, we launched our clubs, and since then we've raised the bar because we knew we were starting to see 125s and 150s occurring. So we, hey, let's do the 150 bushel club. And growers were, you go to a meeting, hey, raise your hand if you think 150 bushel wheat's possible. You might get one person. Today, 80% of that room will raise their hand and say 150 bushel wheat's possible. So that's where we're going. That's where these genetics are reaching, and in conjunction with the correct management practices. You need them both too. They're an interdependent relationship. You need the genetics and you need the management.
Yeah, it's really what's changed, I guess, recently, is that the wheat crop has always been that secondary crop, or the crop they put out there as a rotation crop. And, now we've seen with management, so we can really drive those yields high. And I don't know, do you know what is the wheat record in the U.S.? Do we know that information?
It's over 200.
Over 200 bushels. That's crazy.
That is amazing.
Yeah.
That's a lot of wheat.
It's a lot of wheat, and it's a lot of horsepower at the combine to harvest that type of yield too.
Oh, I can imagine.
But when you look, we've awarded since 2021, so only 4 years. You have 77
people that we've awarded that have been in the 100, 125, 150 bushel club.
Yeah, all the clubs.
Yeah, and that's field averages. And we've got some people at the end, we talk about the 100 bushel club, they'll turn in their whole farm. So it's amazing. We've got people that are averaging their whole farm is over 100 bushels per acre.
It's tremendous.
That's awesome.
And it's almost, in some geographies, and it's probably the further south, south of Interstate 70, wheat double crop is outcompetes the corn acre. And truly, even as you move north, it'll outcompete the corn acre unless your APH is 250 on corn, 270, and you're running out of that double crop soybean option. It'll go as far as you can double crop.
Absolutely, but we've had over 50 bushel double crop soybeans before, so it can be great profitability.
And there's a longer value to wheat than just that single year of crop. and I'm talking more about this recently, is we look at economics as the driver of single year economics, as this is what I need to plant this year. And some guys play the markets based on, do I go heavier corn, do I plant more beans, do I plant more wheat, or do I not plant wheat, based on current year economics. And while that currently happens, there's a longer tail with wheat. So you have the soil health. The cover crops is getting a lot of play and a lot of press because of the soil health and the biodiversity. Well, you do achieve that with wheat. Wheat is the original cash cover crop. You just get to combine it versus terminating it in the spring. And then there's crop rotation studies. The University of Illinois had a multi-year crop rotation study. With having wheat in the rotation, it increased corn yields 10 to 12 bushel to the acre.
Oh, wow.
And it increased your soybean yields 3 to 5. And so that biodiversity, organic matter, we have a customer that was 100% no-till and went to a corn, wheat, double crop bean, back to corn rotation. Over 15 years, he doubled his organic matter. So
that's impressive.
He was testing every 4 years, and he charted it out, and he goes, look at what I've achieved from, it was 2005 to 2020. So a 15-year period, he went from 1.8 to 4.1.
Wow.
So there's more value than just that, well, what did I make per acre selling my wheat?
I think you're exactly right. There's some companies out there right now that are getting more creative on how can we benefit financially from a cover crop. And wheat is the ultimate financially cash cover crop, like you talked about. It gives you all the soil health benefits. It captures the carbon, yet you can still make a pretty good profit on a wheat crop, especially once we come back with the double crop soybeans. So
Absolutely.
I completely agree with you on that.
Mm-hmm.
So, Matt, it's been great having you. AgriMAXX Wheat, Class Act brand, Wehmeyer Seed Company, Class Act company. So, appreciate you being on, all the insights, information. It's been second to none. I think if you'll have us, or we'll definitely have you, if you'll have us again, we'd like to get maybe even talking about some of the varieties a little bit closer to that August time frame when we're looking at wheat planting for next year.
Yeah, we have some cool things in store. Yep, new one's coming.
Excellent. Well, appreciate you being on. And with that, Eric, I think we probably ought to wrap this thing up.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody.
Till next time.